Good morning to everybody. My name is Peter Hertwig. I am a head of unit in the European Commission's Director General for Research and Innovation. My unit is dealing with the business processes for implementing Horizon 2020 and in the future Horizon Europe. I start by introducing the team that will be with you in this meeting today. So I am with colleagues from two other units in the same directorate. We will have presentations from Isabelle Leroy, who is from our legal unit, and will talk about the rules for governing the personnel costs. And we will have also a presentation from a colleague from our audit unit, Dinos Alevisopoulos, will speak about the most frequent errors and how best to avoid them. And then we have also David Michuto, again from the legal unit, who will help in replying your questions. So far on the introduction of the team. And then, of course, we have Olivier Margan and Emmanuel Krollen in the background who will help us running this event smoothly from the technical side. So why are we here today? Why do we organize this webinar? If our records are correct, you are all somehow involved in the running of a grant or several grants under Horizon 2020. And one part of the implementation of these grants is, of course, the management of the financial side. And we unfortunately have to observe, also confirmed by audits from the European Court of Auditors, that overall the rate of errors that beneficiaries make in reporting and claiming their costs is still relatively high, and it is in a certain sense unacceptably high. This is not only bad for us, but it's any kind of error that you make. I mean, it doesn't have to be by intention. It is very often just by mistake because the rules are not 100% clear or so. But any of these errors might have also annoying effects on yourself, apart from the trouble that it creates for us. Because if in case you are subject to an ex-post audit and such errors are detected, it might have the consequence of recoveries. You will have to pay back money, sometimes considerable sums, and this is all in some cases only for some very stupid mistakes that could have been avoided from the outset. So the purpose of the webinar today is really to go with you through the potential pitfalls and to remind you again what the rules are. And we will today also focus in particular on the personnel costs, because we see from all the ex-post audits that the personnel costs are the most error-prone area among all the costs. We might have later on also webinars on other types of costs, but to tackle the major source of errors, we start with a series of such webinars on the personnel costs. Maybe a word on the technical running of this meeting. So we are a high number of participants. We expect more than 1,000 people. That means also that you are all muted, so it's not possible for you to give you the floor. And we will also ask you to put your questions on the substance, not into the chat here, but to use the Slido. I think you have all the necessary access contacts in the chat box. We will have short presentations, and we will then have ample possibilities for replying to your questions. Please put your questions in Slido, but don't only put your questions in Slido, but also look at the questions of others, because it is well possible that the question that you want to ask is already there. And if this is the case, you just vote on the other question so that it gets a higher interest, and we will then at the end go through the questions in the order of number of likes, so to say, so that the questions that interest most of you will get the first priority. So far on the running of this meeting, And before I hand over to Isabel for the first presentation, I would open the Slido for two first little poll questions. They are basically there to find out a bit and know who actually is here behind the screens and who are our participants. So Olivier, you are starting to show us the results, and you are already, as I see, very diligent in going to Slido and replying to these questions. So it is just to know what kind of organization you represent in this meeting. And so the question was whether you are an employee of an SME, or you are an owner manager yourself of the SME, or anything else. Okay, I wait for a little while to give you the chance to all reply. Numbers are increasing. So if you, in case you don't know yet where to go in Slido, we have just put again the hyperlink into the chat box. Okay, I think we can continue running this first poll in the background, but we see the figures are stabilizing, meaning that more than half of you are indeed representing SMEs, either as the owner yourself or as an employee. And then around 40% are from non-SME organizations. Okay, thank you very much. I think we don't have to spend more time on this. So, Olivier, can you bring up the second slide of question, please? So here we just want to know whether you are on your own in the grant or if you work with other organizations in a collaborative grant. Okay, I think also here the figure is very clear. The vast majority of you work actually in consortia. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I think we will now switch to the first presentation. And I hand over the floor to my colleague Isabelle Leroy for explaining us all the details of the personnel cost rules. Please, Isabelle.
Good morning, everyone. So I work in the Common Legal Support Service, where we provide legal support for the implementation of Horizon 2020 notably. And so this morning, I'm going to talk you through some important aspects of personal costs. And as I now put up my slides, I will first want to explain that as today, the objective is to avoid errors. We're going to focus on the simplest and safest way to declare personal costs. So actually, as you may or may not yet know, under Horizon 2020, there's quite a large choice of options from which beneficiaries to some extent can choose how to declare their personal costs. But some of these options are rather complex. So that means firstly that we wouldn't have time to explain them all this morning. And also as they are complex, they can lead more possibly to errors, especially if you're not an experienced participant. So it won't be the focus of our presentation today. I will just raise red flags when we mention these more complex options. But what we will do today is point you towards the simpler options, which are we consider more appropriate to keep it simple, especially if you are a newcomer. So if this works now. Yes. So the first key point that I want you to keep in mind is that each framework program has its own rules. So by framework program, I mean what you can see on the slide. So there was FP7 that started in 2007. Then we had Horizon 2020 that started in 2014. And now in 2021, this is the beginning of Horizon Europe. Now, today we will be talking about Horizon 2020, and this is still very relevant as it concerns projects that will still be running for several years. And even after they stop running, you can still get an audit on a Horizon 2020 project, let's say until 2027, for instance. So if you hear that Horizon 2020 is ending, that only concerns the signature of new grants. But for the grants that are already signed, this is very relevant to know the rules, and all the knowledge that you can get now on Horizon 2020 will still be useful for a good while. Now, the fact that each program has its own rules does not mean that all the rules radically change from one program to the other. Some aspects change and some aspects remain. But today on Horizon 2020, I want to explain further that you may know that there are different types of grants, and today we will be talking mostly about the grants that reimburse part of your actual cost, and here we are talking about real costs, and that's because that's mainly where errors can be made. There are also other types of grants that are based on lump sums or unit costs, for example, in Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions. But these are simpler from the point of view of reporting costs because they use fixed amounts. And so they will not be the point of focus, and we won't explain these grants. We will focus on the actual cost-based grants, which, by the way, are the vast majority of the grants. Now about personal costs. So what are they basically? They are the costs for time worked by persons on a Horizon 2020 project. So the standard case for this is the case of employees. So the person hired by a beneficiary with an employment contract. Then the second case that you see is seconded staff. That means that you as a beneficiary can declare personal costs for staff that is provided or rather seconded to you by another legal entity. So the personnel is still employed and paid by another legal entity, but it is at the disposal of a beneficiary. And this is typical, for example, for universities or certain public entities. Then you have the case of owners of a participant in an action that is a small or medium-sized enterprise, so an SME. And we saw in the poll that there are many of you in the audience, so we will be giving more details about this specific case later on in the presentation. And finally, the last case is other contracts. So not employment, but still people working on the actions, and that would be typically the case of consultants, but that's subject to certain conditions that they may fall under personal costs. So we will see that a bit more on what are the conditions, and that if their conditions are not fulfilled for personal costs, they may fall under other cost categories that could still be eligible. Now, this is a slide with a lot of information, and before you get impressed with this slide, I just want to say that this is to show you the variety of the menu that we offer in terms of possibilities and options to declare personal costs, and this is notably under actual costs. But within this menu, we will be pointing today to what we can call as a path of simple options to declare personal costs, and this is shown in light blue on the slide. So you can keep in mind that there are other options, and they can be useful, notably for perhaps more experienced participants who can have a better grasp of how they can apply them, and especially how can apply them correctly. But if you want to keep it simple, and that's a good strategy to avoid errors, the blue path is advisable, notably for first participation in a project. And as you can see very, very briefly, because we will explain this further, what we see in the blue path is notably a calculation which is annual and based on annual productive hours, which are 1720. Now, just in regard of questions that received before the presentation, I would like to just clarify briefly at this point that today we are going to be talking about direct personal costs. And here this is in opposition to indirect costs, because indirect costs under Horizon 2020 are covered by an overall flat rate of 25%, which is automatically calculated in the system. So it's not a primary concern for errors. And today our focus is the direct personal costs. Now about the calculation of direct personal costs. This is basically the formula to calculate them under Horizon 2020 actions. So you multiply the number of hours worked by a person on the action by an hourly rate. And you can relate to this in a way because maybe in your everyday life, this is similar to what you would do to think of the costs of the work of a painter or a cleaner in your house, and that would be the way that you would calculate if they would be paid per hour. Now, we need to know more about the two elements of this formula. So to know the hours worked on the project, you are going to need time records, and that will basically be timesheets. And to know the hourly rate, you can't come up with an hourly rate in any manner. You will need to apply the formula that is laid down in the grant agreement. And now I'm going to detail these two elements further in the next slides. So about the hours worked on the project, we mean here hours that are really worked on the project, and by really worked, we mean notably that they are not just budgeted. So you can't refer only to what you planned in the budget initially. In practice, there are often deviations from what was budgeted because that's only an estimation before the work is done. And at the time when we are reporting personal costs, what we want to know is the real figure once the work was carried out. It's in the same line of thought. It's not either estimated time, and it's not either time allocated. And here we are thinking notably that it's not a percentage of the time of work of the person. We know in practice there are work contracts where there are percentages that the person will have to work on a project, and this is fine in terms of work contract, but it's not what you can use to report your costs under Horizon 2020. Now, to do such recording of the real hours, it means that you need timesheets, and that's written in red at the bottom of the slide because it's very important. And you always need them unless in the very specific exception where a person works exclusively on the action. And in this case, you can use a declaration of exclusive dedication. But generally, the main message is that you need timesheets to show the number of hours worked on the action. And if you bump into some reluctancy to fill in timesheets, please keep in mind that the hours must be supported by these records. Otherwise, the costs may not be eligible. Now we have, concerning the information that we want to see in timesheets, we have some minimum requirements, and they are explained in a document called the Annotated Model Grant Agreement. It's a very useful document that I will maybe refer to several times in the presentation, and I will provide a link at the end of the presentation. And in this document, you can also find a template, a link to a template for a timesheet. This is not a compulsory template. You can use it if this is helpful for you, but if you are already using your own timesheets, you can use these timesheets as long as they fulfill our minimum requirements. Now about the second element of the formula, which is the hourly rate. So you can see the formula to calculate the hourly rate itself. That's dividing personal costs by productive hours. Now, what to put in these two elements? Firstly, about the personal costs. So under personal costs, you can put firstly the salary, that's obvious, but also social contributions, and also whatever other costs included in the remuneration, but to the extent that the person is objectively entitled to get such element of the remuneration in accordance with national law and the employment contract. This, for example, would not cover an arbitrary bonus. Now about the productive hours. Here we have three options. So you remember that I showed you earlier a whole tree of options, And within this tree, we were recommended a blue path of the easier options. And here, the easier option that we recommend is to use a fixed number of annual productive hours, which is 1720 hours. So you can use this number regardless of how many hours the person actually worked or has to work. And you wouldn't deduct anything for sick leave. And the only thing that you would deduct if there is parental leave. However, if the person works part-time, then you would apply a pro rata. For example, if the person is working 50% in its contract, you would apply a pro rata as the figure 1720 is for a full-time employee. Now, I will not detail about the other two options for individual or standard annual productive hours because they are more complex and subject to specific conditions, and we want to focus on the simpler options today. Still about the hourly rate, now we're going to talk about how many times you must calculate it. And here you have two possibilities. And you can see already that one is written in bigger letters, so you know already which one we're going to recommend to keep it simple, and that's the annual hourly rate. So that means you calculate it once per year. And here we are talking about the financial year that you use in your accounting. So you calculate the hourly rate once per your complete financial year. So when you have the full figures of your financial year, and you divide the annual personal costs by annual productive hours, preferably 1720, as we explained the last slide. And you have to do this for each person. Now, under annual hourly rate, you see a little warning, and that's for the case where you have to report personal costs for months for which the financial year is not yet closed. So you don't have the information on the full financial year. An example is if you had to report on the 31st of March 2021, and your financial year will be closing on the 31st of December 2021, you don't have the full figures. So in this case, you have to use the figures of the last closed financial year, and in our example, that would be 2020. Nevertheless, this is still the simpler option for the calculation of your hourly rate. Now you have the possibility as an alternative to calculate the hourly rate per month. However, this is not the option that we consider as the easiest, because firstly, you have to do this calculation 12 times during the year and for each person. Moreover, there are some specific rules that apply, and one of them is that if you have elements of your remuneration like a 13th month, then you can't apply it, just add it in the month where you pay it. You would have to calculate a pro rata of this element of remuneration and apply it every month in your calculation for every month. So this option is generally considered more tricky. Now, this is called the double ceiling. This is a check that you have to do at the end of the calculation of your personal costs. And you have to keep this in mind that what you declare cannot be above two ceilings, and these ceilings are linked to the elements that you used when you calculated your hourly rate. So that's the personal costs and the productive hours that you used in your calculation. So this check is just that you cannot declare more hours or more personal costs than the numbers that you used to calculate the hourly rate. So I just explained this again in more details. You cannot declare more hours of work of a person for a year than the number of annual productive hours that you put in your formula to calculate the hourly rate. And you cannot claim more personal costs for a person for a year than the amount that you used also when calculating your hourly rate. So this implies no loss, in your calculations. It's just to ensure that you are not declaring more than what you should. So now we've gone through mostly all the basics of the personal costs, and this slide is to tell you that when comes the moment of reporting your personal costs in practice, you have at your disposal a tool to help you, and it's called the Personal Cost Wizard. So this tool is optional, but it's really helpful, especially for newcomers. So in this tool, you will still get to choose your options, like, for example, annual or monthly calculation of the hourly rate, or which productive hours you want to use. And the wizard will simply help you with the calculations and check the ceilings. And what you see in this screen is the entry point for the wizard when you are filling your financial statement at the time of reporting. Now that we've done all the basics, I'm going to cover a few special cases. So the first one here is if you see the question of this beneficiary, which is that I want to pay to my employees more than their normal salary for their work in this prestigious grant. And here, in all humility, we are referring to a Horizon 2020 grant. So if you think this question is very strange, this is most likely because you are not in the case of this beneficiary, and you should simply not worry about this slide. Here, we are in fact addressing remuneration practices which vary from one country to another. And for some among you, this question may seem very relevant, and that's the answer that we would give as the European Commission. It is that if you do this of paying more than the normal salary only for European grants, we cannot accept it. And by the way, this is an overall principle that if your calculations to report costs are specific only for our grants, we don't accept that. However, if the beneficiary answered to that they don't do it only for Horizon 2020, but all prestigious grants, then we would determine on this basis that this is a case that we call project-based remuneration. And then there are specific rules that apply. And it requires specific attention because it is one of the complex features of the personal costs. And if you are in this case, we advise you to look into the annotated model grant agreement for the section on project-based remuneration, and we'll provide the link in the last slide. Now, I will cover two other special cases. So first, there is the special case when you are the owner of a SME that participates in the Horizon 2020 action and you do not receive a salary. If you do receive a salary, you just apply the formulas that we've just explained. But if you do not receive a salary, there is no hourly rate to be calculated, because we have fixed the hourly rate that you must apply, and this will be automatically calculated for you. And we call this the SME owner unit cost. Now, if you are an SME owner that is compensated for your work by any other mean than a salary, you also fall under this fixed hourly rate. And that's, for instance, if you are compensated by means of dividends or a service contract or another non-employment contract, you can't use these elements to declare personal costs. You have to use the SME owner unit cost. And then the other specific case is the one of consultants. So they're not employees, but they're working for you on the project. And how do you declare the costs? So you can declare them under personal costs in some conditions. That's indicated in Article 6282 of your grant agreement. The most striking conditions are notably that there must be a direct contract between the natural person and the beneficiary, and also that the consultant is working under similar conditions as those of an employee. But there are other conditions that must be checked. What happens is if you fulfill all these conditions, you can declare the cost of consultants as personal costs. But if you do not fulfill the conditions, then that does not mean that the costs are not eligible, but rather that maybe they will fall in an other cost category. That would be notably purchase of service under other direct contracts, and less frequently under subcontracting. So just the main thing then is that if you have consultants, you must pay attention to these distinctions so that you declare the costs in the right category and that you apply the right conditions. So this is now my last slide. So I hope you have a better understanding of the simpler way to declare personal costs. Now, if you want to explore this further or look for information on the more complex options, the document where you can find all the explanations is the annotated model grant agreement. Then if you want to have information on a more practical side of the management of the grant, you have the online manual. And if with these elements you still have questions, then there's two places where to send your questions. Firstly, there's the network of national contact points. So these are people from your country and they know your specificities, they know your national legislation, but there are still experts in Horizon 2020, and they're also specialized in certain areas even more. For example, you have national contact points specialized in legal and financial issues, others, for example, for Marie Sklodowska actions, and you can find all the details and contact details at the link. And then the other place to send your questions is the Research Inquiry Service. This is how to send questions to the Commission. So that would be to the people who drafted the rules and the guidance documents. So at this point, I now want to thank you for your attention, and I understand that I'm passing the floor to my colleague Dinos for his presentation.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Isabel. I think that was a very clear presentation. And again, to everybody listening to us, don't hesitate putting your questions that you have during the course of these presentations already into Slido. And again, please vote on the questions of others if you are also interested in one or the other of the questions that are already there. I repeat again, at the end, in the question and answer session, we will go through all the Slido questions in the order of number of likes. And I think now I hand over to Dinos for the second presentation on the errors that we detected in ex-post audits and what are the possibilities to avoid such errors. Dinos, please.
Hello. Right, I hope that you can now see the presentation and that you can listen to me. So
yes, everything fine.
Today we are presenting the errors as we observe them in the audits that we perform. So the information that is going to be presented today, it comes from the experience that we have built while we are auditing while we are auditing beneficiaries, that they have been granted amounts. And we see that during the audits that we perform, there are errors. So let's first of all examine why do the errors occur and what is an error by nature. So first question is, why do we have errors when we submit financial statements and we report them back to the granting authority for payment? Well, the first reason that we have seen is that the rules are misunderstood. And misunderstanding of the rules, it means that the rules are sometimes complicated or that the rules failed to explain with clarity the issues at stake and the subject matter. The second reasoning for the errors is the lack of the attention to the details of the provision of the grant agreement. And this is a politically correct way to say that if the beneficiaries, if you have read the articles, the clauses and the provisions in more detail, and if you have invested more time on the understanding of the rules, the errors would have been prevented. So we see it from both angles. We see an area for development for us, for the European Commission services that they write the rules, but also an area for development from your side, which means that you need still to further invest on understanding the specificities and the whereabouts of the grant agreement that you have signed. These are the two matters that they consolidate the reason for the erroneous environment that we have built in Horizon 2020. And when we have an error, we also have subsequent consequences of it. First of all, for the beneficiaries, it is obvious that the amounts that they have been sent back to you and they have been paid are not optimally used. And then we will end up into a process of asking the money back in a form of a recovery or in an offsetting of a future payment. So there are financial, in most of the cases, there are financial implications for the beneficiaries. But there are also administrative and reputational consequences for the European Commission services. The higher the error rate, the more the scrutiny that we get from those that they audit ourselves, from the European Court of Auditors and from the budgetary authorities. And also an increased error rate would lead to further administrative efforts and corrective measures from our side that they consume unnecessarily and not efficient amount of resources that could be used elsewhere. So from both angles, from yours and from ours, the erroneous environment is something that we don't want. And that is the reason that we are coming back to you, even at this stage on the Horizon 2020 process, to let you know how to avoid errors and how to do things better in the future. This is a visual representation of an error and how does it come from the population, how it is extracted, audited, and reported. So if we start from the left pillar, we present you in a graphical visualization the population of the grant agreements and the population of the financial statements that they exist out there in a certain moment, let's say in a year, across the member states and the associated countries, and whoever has been granted funds from the Horizon 2020 funds. So with different colors, we have provided a segmentation of the market. And let's say that the first green is the universities, the second is the research organization, the third is the industry, the fourth are the SMEs, and so on and so forth. Obviously, the totality of the population is impossible to be audited. So what we do is that every single year we extract a sample with this kind of statistical tools, that the sample that we extract is a fair representation of the reality. In other words, we cannot audit the totality of the population, but we can audit a sample, an extraction of the population, which presents a clear representation of the stake and of the segmentation of the population. Every year we focus on different variables, and every year we extract a different amount of sample. But since our strategy is annual and multi-annual, across the years we are able to exhaust the population through auditing a specific set of sample every single year. So as it was said before, the population is not auditable as such, but the sample it is on its totality. That's why the sample serves as a denominator on the right-hand side, and on the bottom side of the ratio, we put the denominator, the amounts that we have audited in the year. And in the numerator, on the upper side of the ratio, we only report the negative adjustments, which means adjustments that they are in the favor of the European Commission services, and adjustments that reflects errors that they have been taken place by the beneficiaries and by you. So by dividing the errors over the extraction of the sample, we calculate an error rate, which we then report to the parliamentarians, we report to the budgetary authority, and we report to our auditors, the European Court of Auditors. And this is the basis for the whole discussion. The higher the error rate, the more the administrative burden and the more the reputational risk at stake, the more the efforts that we have to do from our side and your side to reduce. And to do that, we need to do audits. And that is the reason that we have audit, not only because it is a contractual requirement in every single contract that you have, in every single grant agreement that you have signed, there is a requirement, there is a clause for audit, but it is also to make sure that we can provide the decision makers in our hierarchy with elements of assurance to let them know on the level of the error rate. So where we are we above or below the residual total error rate of 2%? This is what the budgetary authority considers as the threshold. Whatever is above this is significant, it shouldn't be, and it is subject to discussions and focus. That's why we're trying to keep the error rate in a level which is lower than 2% of the global expenditure, which is not the case today. That's why, for instance, we have this today's session to let you know that the error rate is high and we should bring it down. So which are the errors? The errors are mostly under personnel costs. This is the vast majority of the errors that we have seen, and this reflects reality because the vast majority of the financial statements are reported into the cost category of personnel cost, which presents the fact that most of the research is done by researchers, human beings, that they are remunerated. So the higher the amount of the remuneration, the higher the financial statements under personnel cost, And obviously, the concentration of the errors is at the level of the personnel cost. And within the cost category of personnel cost, the major driver of the errors is the incorrect use of the productive hours. That means that the denominator of the hourly rate in the presentation of Isabel before and in my slides in the future, you will see that the denominator, the productive hours, was not properly reflected, was not properly used. And this is the major reason for the errors that we've seen in Horizon 2020. As it was said before, there are 3 options to calculate your productive hours. We are giving you insights for both of the 3 of them, and we believe that by focusing on what we are going to say before and by reviewing what it was said in the previous slides, you will be able to reduce the errors on the productive hours. The other amounts of errors that we see under personnel cost is the mistaken remuneration. That means that the numerator of the hourly rate was not correct, or that the time that you have charged for the action does not reflect reality, either because there are errors or because the information in the time records is unreliable or missing. So, since the errors under personnel cost, this is the only formula that you have to use and apply and understand to make sure that the errors on the personnel costs are reduced. So here what you have to make sure is that for calculating your personnel cost, you need to multiply the hours that you have worked on the action, times a ratio. And in the ratio, in the numerator, you report your total personnel cost as this is stipulated on the general accepted accounting practices of your country. In the vast majority of the countries, the total remuneration is the totality of the basic salary plus social security contribution plus any eligible add-on cost. You need to add the basic salary of a person together with the social security contribution and any, if any, eligible add-on cost to get a totality of a remuneration that you report in the numerator. And you divide this by your total productive hours with one of the 3 options that we offer. If you do this correctly, then you don't have errors and we should be all happy. So let's see how to do it correctly. So first of all, you need to make sure that your time recording system is consistent with the HR records. An example of this, that means that on the day that you are sick, or on the day that you are working for another action, or in a day that you do not work for the European project, you do not charge time for the action that you are declaring cost. You need, therefore, to make sure that the consistency of your time records reconciles with your HR records. If you're absent, if you're not in the office, if you're not working, if you're sick, do not charge time on these periods of time to the action, because this is an error. And if we observe that you do it, then we will declare that the costs are not eligible. You need to make sure that your time records is properly dated and signed. That means that there is a signature and there is a date on your time records, and that your time records do not exceed your full-time employment. In other words, if you work in a specific amount of time, and this is stipulated in the contract, if you do not work overtime, do not access this into your time recording system, because we will define the excess and we will consider it as not eligible. And the time recording system needs to be sufficient in terms of information. That means that your name needs to be there, the grant that you have been, the action that you have been charging time needs to be there, the time by itself needs to be there, there needs to be a signature, and there needs to be a date. So these are the 5 minimum conditions that you need to make sure that they exist in your time recording system, either if it is electronic or if it is an embedded IT application tool in your system, or just an Excel spreadsheet. Make sure that your numerator is correct. And as it was said before, in the numerator, you put the totality of your eligible personnel cost, you put all your salaries, basic salaries, your social security contribution, and the taxes at source. And you do not include ineligible items, you do not include indirect items, you do not include imputed, budgeted, and estimated amounts. This is the major driver of errors that we have seen. In other words, we have seen that the personnel cost does not reflect your real cost as it comes from the financial statements, the trial balance, or the general ledger, but it includes estimated, budgeted, and imputed amounts which are not allowed. Estimated and budgeted hours and times and costs are not eligible in the hourly rate calculation. You should make sure that you exclude them from the calculations. And the denominator here is where the most of the errors take place. The denominator, in order to make sure that you do it correctly, you need to apply correctly one of the three options. And obviously, we give an advice. The advice is with green. It was said before in the presentation before, but now we emphasize it, that the easiest, safest, and the way that we propose, if you are struggling and if you do not know what exactly to report as productive hours, is the application of the 1,720 hours. You need to make sure that you apply it consistently across the board and correctly. It is just a figure, you take it and you put it as a denominator into your productive hours calculation. If you do it on an annual basis, if you do it on a monthly basis, you just put on a monthly basis 1/12 of this. This is the easiest and the most straightforward. Then the other two options, the second is the individual annual productive hours. And that means that every single person in your organization has his or her own set of productive hours. And therefore, Mr. X, Mr. Y, Mr. Z will have different hours among themselves. And that would require that you are able to measure correctly and precisely the productive hours of each single person in your organization. Therefore, you would need something more than a single Excel table. You would need to put other controls and systems in place to make sure that you are able to count precisely every single person in your organization, what is his or her set of productive hours. In other words, what are his or her workable hours per year plus overtime minus absences. And the third option that we give, which is most favorable for the big organizations and those that they have a set of personnel which is bigger than the average, is the standard annual productive hours. And here the proposal of the option is that you calculate your workable time and you make sure that whatever you report as productive time is not less than 90% of your workable time. This is a minimum threshold. If you fell below the 90%, you are in an erroneous environment. You need to make sure that you are above the 90% of your workable time. You need to calculate it in a global level for the entity or for a specific amount of employees that they have the same properties. And you need to make sure that you apply it consistently and correctly. You need to make sure that you are able to calculate the workable hours and deduct nothing more than it is less than 90% of it to put it as a denominator into your productive hours. You understand from this slide that the second and the third option require both tools, controls, and calculations. And by the moment that you enter into this, you are entering into an erroneous environment. That's why we still come back to you with a proposal of 1,720 hours. You put it as a denominator and you ensure that you do it correctly, and then there's not going to be any error. Now, how to avoid errors? Well, again, avoiding errors by making sure that your time charged to the action is correct. You need to be able to measure the time that you have spent to the funded action. You need for this to make sure that you have time records and that the time records meet the 5 minimum conditions in the grant agreement. You need to make sure that the remuneration that you have used as a numerator in your hourly rate is correct. And be careful, you need to make sure that the denominator, the productive hours therefore, is correct. It is one of the three options and preferably is the option number 1. You need to make sure that your personnel cost formula reconciles. In other words, the multiplication of the hours to the action times the hourly rate is correct. You need to make sure that the transaction listing from your trial balance reconciles with your accounts. Therefore, it doesn't have estimated, imputed, or budgeted figures. And you need to make sure that the people that you have employed in the action are covered by an employment contract, which is in place, and it can establish the relationship between the person, the action, and the entity. Last but not least, before you submit your financial statements and before you request the European Commission services to pay you, do a kind of controls by yourself. Make sure that you have these slides and you can go backwards and you have done all the tests. Make sure that you have read what you have signed in the grant agreement. Make sure that the figures reconcile and that you are happy by yourself when you are submitting your financial statements. Do not just send them like this, requesting any kind of amount, because errors may happen, and because this is not the correct way of doing that. So please exercise some prudence by the moment that you press the button and you submit your financial statements. And with this, I think we are done for the audit side. Now the floor back to Peter for questions and for discussions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dinos. Indeed, we will now go into our question and answer session. But before opening it, I would ask you to reply to us another two very simple polls. And Olivier, can you switch on the next poll, please? Okay, so this is now after what you have heard, but also after the experience you already had with reporting costs. How do you judge? What is your impression on the complexity on all these rules? Okay, I think the figures again are stabilizing, and we reached the 300 replies. So it is in a certain sense also to us reassuring that only a minority think that indeed these rules are very complex, 10%. And we are the least to deny that they are a bit complex, but even close to 1/4 of you think they are reasonably clear. Okay, thank you very much. And then I think we have one more poll related to the personnel cost wizard, and there I'm particularly curious to see whether you actually know what we are talking about. So the question is, do you actually know this cost wizard tool? And if yes, do you think it's useful? Okay, I think also here the picture is very clear. The vast majority of you don't even know what this is. So we hope that the presentation today has given you at least a hint, but we can then also in the question and answer session be yet again a bit more specific. We actually recommend the use of this wizard, in particular for smaller organizations or organizations who are completely new to this European Union funding. And if indeed you are a small organization, you have only a very few people working on the project, then it is also not such a big effort to encode your costs by using this wizard. And if you do so, you can be reasonably certain that you don't make mistakes, because the wizard guides you through a set of questions and gathering the data that is needed for doing all these calculations, and then is doing the calculations automatically. Okay, thank you very much. And then indeed, I would open the questions and answer session. And again, I invite you to continue putting questions into the Slido, but we now start already replying to them. And again, please also vote on the questions of others if you are interested in the same question. So let's start. The first question. We calculate 1 person month equivalent as 160 hours per month. do we need to recalculate our person months using the 1720 hours per year standard, which would mean 143.33 hours per month? I think we will be able to clarify this misunderstanding. Isabel or David, do you want to come in on this one?
Okay, hi, this is David. To justify my presence, look, you have seen, as Isabel explained it this morning, the detailed rules that we have to calculate the personal cost. So the cost dimension of the personal participation of your employees or consultants, etc., etc. So you have seen that we have very clear rules, the formulas, the limitations, etc., etc. On the other side, the person months that you calculate for the technical reporting, that you can do as you usually do. It's up to you how to convert the person efforts into person months. So if you normally use 160 hours, for us is fine. Now, it's true that if you don't have a usual way to do this conversion, well, the easiest way is, of course, use the same ratio that you use with the number of annual productive hours. Because if there is a divergence between the person months, for instance, that you indicated in Annex 1 for a certain work package and what you actually needed at the end, well, when you are doing the comparison, it's easier if you have the same conversion rule for the cost that for the technical efforts. But this is not an obligation, and I insist. For how you convert the time the person worked in the action into person months for the technical reporting, that's up to you to decide. You can do it in accordance with your usual practices. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We go immediately to the next question. May personnel costs be recalculated during the project, for instance, when salary changes? I assume this is related to the question of annual or monthly calculation, but maybe the question also implies retroactive increases of cost claims for earlier periods. I know, so maybe you can cover all this.
I hope they do not. So the easiest way to see this. Again, you have seen how we are defined, how we have defined it in the model grant agreement, how the personal costs are to be calculated. So the basic or the most general and the recommended option is to do the calculation based on annual hourly rates. So at the end of the year, you calculate an hourly rate that you multiply by the number of hours that the person worked in the action. So obviously, if in 2021 I will have a salary increase at the end of 2021, my hourly rate will reflect my salary increase. I will not get into the details now because Isabel, I think, already explained it quite completely. I would say. You have the option of the monthly hourly rates, which we do not recommend because it's more complex and more risk-prone, but you have this option. In that case, the salary increase is reflected immediately in the month in which the salary increase happens. Differently, if you are in annual hourly rates, you may see that the salary increase is not reflected until for perhaps the next reporting period because you had to use the last close financial year for the last months of the ongoing reporting period. So there is a time gap between the moment in which the salary increases happens and the moment in which you can start, I would say, charging more via the new hourly rate calculated. So this is for the calculation. Now, I wonder if it has something to do with the budget. And in any case, I think it's a good moment to recall that when you do the budget, you do an estimation of what the project you think will cost. And then as any estimation, of course, there's going to be not exactly the same when you are carrying on the project, meaning that whatever you estimated at the moment of the proposal and whatever is in your annex to, so the budget of the action when you sign the grant agreement, when you are reporting costs, you report the reality. Both Isabel and Dinos insisted on don't use estimations when reporting, don't use allocation of costs. You must report the reality on the basis of what the grant agreement tells you how to calculate this cost. So you may perfectly deviate, and this is really the normal situation, that you deviate or during the implementation of the action between what you expected, both in person months as in costs. If this deviation goes into the technical part and is big, we will probably ask you for explanations why you needed 12 person months rather than 6 as you expected at the beginning. If you go into the cost reporting, you report the reality of the cost. And if at the end there is no enough money, so to say, well, we will not be able to cover all your costs, but you must report always the reality. And I think I'm going to stop there for that, because it's a very wide question, and otherwise I would be speaking 50 minutes at least about this.
Okay, thank you. So next question, indeed very pertinent. Do we need to present documents to support the costs? I think there are two moments where this question is pertinent. Once it is in the periodic reporting when you send your cost claims, and the other occasion is if indeed the auditors knock on your door and want to check the costs. For the first part, I can reply myself. For sending the cost claims as part of the periodic report, we do not ask you to send supporting documents, but of course you are supposed to keep these supporting documents at home. And then when the auditors come, you will have indeed to provide supporting documents. And I give the question to Dinos for telling us the details of which supporting documents you would expect actually.
Indeed. In all the audits, let's focus on the personnel cost. In all the audits, you will have to make sure that you present a series of documentation. And that would be extracts from your ledger, either sub-ledger of personnel or trial balance. And there we would like to see the person and the remuneration that the person gets. And we would reconcile the extracts of the trial balance to the pay slips. So you need to make sure that the pay slips are readily available, and you keep records of the pay slips on the monthly payments that you provide to your employees. Third thing is the set of contracts. So when we select a sample, we are reviewing the personnel and we are asking for a presentation of the contracts to make sure that there is a link between the person and the action. And last but not least, we want to see the time recording system and the time records in a way that we can make a connection between the person and the action that you are requesting funds. And for this, we need to see the hours that this person has charged for the action that it is funded. And the last thing, we want to see the productive hours. And the productive hours depends on the way that you have selected to apply the options. So if you apply for the 1,720, this is enough. If you have applied for option 2 and 3, we need to see the way that you have calculated the personnel cost. We want to see the way that you have used the productive hours, and therefore we would need evidence for the productive hours. So that would be the minimum of the requirements that we ask in all the audits.
Okay. And then,
Peter, if
yes.
I may, because I think there is another general message that we always give, I think, in these webinars, and based on this question and explanations from Dinos, I think is the right moment to do it. It's very important for everybody to understand that you do not work for the commission or the executive agency or whoever you funding body is giving you the grant. You work for yourselves. So in the grant agreement, you have the obligation or the commitment to do the work as described in Annex 1, and you have a lot of other commitments, among which calculating the eligible cost in accordance with the cost eligibility conditions, so the rules that come into the grant agreement, and keeping the supporting documents to prove that you did this calculation correctly and that the costs were real. Both conditions are necessary to be fulfilled in order to get the EU money. I mean, we have seen many cases in which when the auditors come to do the audit, they don't find sufficient information, or the records are not reliable, or the timesheets are not there, and the beneficiary says, yes, but working for the commission. We are not a client. We are not paying for your services. So the fact that you do the work is fantastic, because it's one of your commitments and it's a necessary element for being entitled to get the EU money, but it is not enough. it is not enough. You need to be able to prove that the costs that you have charged are eligible and calculated in accordance with the grant agreement. Otherwise, it is not enough, I insist. And this is a real thing. We have been taken to court with a couple of cases saying, well, we did the work and we won the cases because it's absolutely obvious that you need to do both things. Doing the project as it was in Annex 1, or if you need to change it, you require an amendment, you ask for an amendment, and declaring only eligible costs. So it's very important and crucial for you to understand these two things. You don't work for the Commission, you work for yourself, and you need to do the work, but also comply with all the other obligations, in particular, all the administrative obligations for the eligibility of cost. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the next question. Can a beneficiary move budget between work packages? I think the short answer is yes, but. And I think for the but, I hand over to Isabel to explain actually how and when it can be done and when we need an amendment, when we do not. Isabel, do you want?
Yes, this is about the flexibility for budget transfers. So there is basically some flexibility. However, the main thing they have to keep in mind is whether you need an amendment or not. And that depends whether you are only moving budget or if in fact what you are moving is tasks that were described in Annex 1 and as described in Annex 1. So if as soon as you are making a significant change to Annex 1 or moving task, changing task in Annex 1, then you would need to require an amendment. And it's only if it's accepted that you make this transfer. Otherwise, if it's just a move of budget, you don't need an amendment.
Okay, thank you. And the next one, when using the standard 1720 method and an employee takes paternity leave during the reporting period, does it change anything? Isabel again?
Yes, so there so paternity leave is part of parental leave, and that's the only thing that you can deduct from the 1720 hours. So when you're doing your calculation, you see how much was taken as part of parental leave, and you deduct it from the 1720 in your calculation. So it does change something.
Okay, very clear. Next question, what kind of documents will be asked as evidence of service provided for consultants? I think this is again for Dinos because this will become pertinent when the auditors come to your premises. Dinos.
Yes, so we go now in after the experience that we have from FP7 and the amount of information that we have gathered, the consultants are mostly covered by the provisions in the grant agreement for the natural persons under direct contract. And here you need to be two things. You need to be a natural person and you need to be under direct contract. Natural person, it means that you are a human being. And under direct contract, it means that you have an employment contract or you have a kind of contract which allows you to work for the entity and that it shows that perhaps you may not belong to the workforce of the entity and may not you be subject to the remuneration of all other employees, but you work for the entity for a specific action. So we want to corroborate these two elements, that you are a person, a freelancer or a consultant or somebody who is recruited for a limited period of time or for a specific period of time to work for the action. And therefore, we would like to see the contractual relationship that you have with the firm, and obviously to recalculate the hourly rate to see how far you are closely assimilated to the work which is done inside the organization, up to which extent there is a deviation between the hourly rates and whether this is justified because of your experience, the skills, the properties, and the abilities that you possess, and the company that has assigned this work to you hasn't. And this is the reason that we are doing this kind of analysis. Another option is that you are recruited through a work agency. And if you are like this, then you are not anymore a consultant that has been recruited from the market, but you have been recruited via a work agency. And therefore, under this pattern, we will also see the contractual relationship that you have between the entity that has recruited you and yourself, but also the relationship between the beneficiary who has got the money and the external provider of workforce. And at these circumstances, you are not personnel cost anymore, but you are mostly another direct cost, and we treat you slightly, but assimilatedly pretty much the same. So slightly differently, but in the same manner. So we treat you as a consultant, and we just test which kind of services you offer to the entity. So conclusion, we need to see the contractual terms that you have signed, and we want to see your remuneration. Two major things.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next question, is it possible to report a part of personnel costs referred to the previous reporting period in the following one? So meaning retroactive reporting. Isabel, is this for you?
Yes, well, technically this is called an adjustment. So it's possible in the next reporting period to declare something different if you made a mistake. However, this is not something that you can do if, for instance, you had to, for example, apply this rule that we call the last close financial year. And so you had to use the figures of the last close financial year, and then you wouldn't be able to update them with new figures in the next reporting period.
Okay. And the next question I see is very similar to the one we replied already. What are the documents that we need to provide in support to the personnel costs? I don't know whether we can add anything to this. I think, Dinos, you replied it already relatively exhaustively.
It's a
But
question.
do you want to add anything?
We have replied, yes.
Okay. So then let's go immediately to the next one. Is there a methodology how to calculate person months? When calculating spent person months, do I have to deduct annual leave taken by the employee working on Horizon 2020? Isabel?
Well, I think my colleague David already addressed this in one of the questions, where he explained that this is not something that we prescribe in our grant agreement or our rules. When you come to explaining the effort in terms of resources, then it's for you to calculate your person month according to your own practices.
Yes, and we should maybe add that this calculation of the person months is not immediately related to the calculation of the costs, because in Horizon 2020, this goes via the formulas that we just described in the slides, and where we have the hourly rate and the hours spent on the project. So these are the variables needed for calculating the costs. This translation into person months is more for the technical reporting, for our project office to judge whether the work you have done and the deliverables that were provided somehow are in compliance with the effort that you have spent. So this person month calculations in Horizon 2020, again, has no direct relation with the calculation of the costs. Okay, next point. Can the timesheets be 100% digital, signature included, or do we need to print them and sign them? And I remember from the last webinar of this kind that, David, you have a very clear answer to this, and there are also very clear conditions as to the systems, the digital systems that have to be used for this. David, do you want to go into the details?
Yeah, let's try to be as simple as possible on this, because the worry here is about what do we qualify as digital or electronic timesheets. So the generic answer is yes, there's no problem. You have an electronic time recording system, but be careful about what you call an electronic. We have seen in some cases just a simple Excel sheet where anyone can get into and type, modify, correct, or write whatever, and nobody signs, nobody verifies, and that's it. That is based on a PC. Yes, you may say it's electronic, but it's certainly not an electronic time recording system, and there's certainly no digital signatures. So if you have one of these standard electronic time recording systems where you have a password and a username, a password, and the system keeps trace of who encoded what when and who modified what when, that's fine. You don't need to print anything else. This username and password combined with the electronic records of modifications for us is a sufficiently secure electronic time recording system. I insist, in our conditions, you need to have the signature of the person working, so the employee and the supervisor. So as far as this is done via the electronic time recording system, where we have a auditable traceability of who did what when, is fine. Otherwise, if you have it done, if you don't have this, for instance, this username passwords verification, you may of course use also Excel timesheets, but then you have to print it and sign it by the person and the supervisor. In any case, for those of you who have nothing, because particularly in SMEs, it's not such a common feature that you keep time records, via the annotated grant agreement, we provide you a possible or an example of a template of a monthly time record, the system, a monthly timesheet that you could perfectly use. It's not mandatory. We are not telling you that you must use that. You can use whatever you are using normally if it fulfills our minimum conditions that you can also find in the annotated grant agreement under Article 18. But if you do not know really how to cope with this and you are trying to figure out how a timesheet that the Commission could accept may look like, you can simply go to this link in the annotated grant agreement. Isabel in her slides showed the link to the annotated grant agreement, and you see there what we are asking for, and you can even use our proposed templates. Voila.
Okay, thank you. Next question, and I somehow expected this. How do we access the cost wizard tool? Can you kindly share the path for it? So maybe Isabel, can you bring up again the slide?
Yes, I will.
And so the main answer is that it is straight and simply implemented in the periodic reporting tool. Yeah, now it comes. Isabel, please.
There you see, and it's under, so it's in the financial statement under direct personal costs. You have this arrow to the entry point of the wizard.
Okay.
And just for clarification, this is when you will be reporting your cost at the end of the reporting period. So then you will have this session to report your cost in the financial statements, and that's where you see it.
And maybe just a very small remark is that the link to the manual will be added on the event page as well for the wizard.
Yes, that's a very good hint. So there is indeed also a guidance note or a manual on how to use this wizard, and we will share it with everybody in the event website. Okay, next question. Can we claim own staff for administrative and management support under an ERC grant? The question might even be wider than just the ERC grants. Isabel.
Yes, in general, administrative staff is considered as indirect cost because their work is not directly related to work on the action. So in general, it falls under this flat rate that we use to calculate all indirect costs. However, in exceptional conditions, if it is the practice of the beneficiary, its usual accounting practice to have direct costs for administrative staff, and if they have the timesheets showing the work of the administrative staff specifically for the action, then it could be considered as a part of the direct personal costs.
Yeah, I think I should emphasize here, you should be here really very prudent and careful. As Isabel says, this can be considered as direct cost only if these costs fulfill all the requirements, including a timesheet for this administrative person, where he can show, or he or she can show, the hours that he or she worked on that particular grant, which in the normal case, in particular in universities where there is a central administrative department, is not really the case. So please be very prudent here if you want to do something like this. Okay, next question. Can the beneficiary of one member state, Italy, declare the costs of the natural person who is a resident in another state, UK, under the direct personnel costs. Isabel again?
Well, I'm not sure if we're talking about an employee that would not cause any issue. And if it's the case of a natural person with a direct contract with the beneficiary, there's no issue concerning the nationality in itself, but the residence in another country would imply that maybe that it's full-time teleworking. And though that's not absolutely impossible, it makes it more difficult to comply with one of the conditions to accept the cost of these natural persons as direct personal costs. And that's the fact that normally the beneficiary is supposed to supervise this type of consultant the same way as they supervise their own employees. So for a person who would be residing in another state, this puts it into question. So you would have to be careful about this. But that's, I repeat, this is the case where you're talking about a consultant. If it's an employee and your usual practice is teleworking, and that's in your internal rules that this person can be teleworking, then that's should not be an issue.
Okay. Next question, will current COVID situation relax some rules? For instance, we could not use a good part of the budget for traveling. Can we use it for personnel costs? So that's on the one hand, again, a question on the flexibility of moving cost items. On the general question on the relaxing of rules under the COVID situation, we actually published a series of frequently asked questions on the frequently asked questions site on the funding and tenders portal. So if you go there and you search for COVID, you will find the list of all these FAQs explaining where indeed the rules were, I wouldn't say relaxed, but interpreted in a way that that was possible to help a bit with the situation. But on the concrete question, I mean, partially we have answered it before, but maybe Isabel, you can again say a word about the budget flexibility.
Yes, so
in general.
Yeah. So in general, and also to say that it's not, it's considering the flexibility that we already have for budget transfers in all cases, we haven't relaxed it further for the COVID. And in fact, so you could possibly transfer part of the budget again, so there to personal costs. But again, that must mean that you're not making a significant change to the task as described in Annex 1. And if you are, then you need an amendment. And if you have a doubt about whether this is a significant change, then the advice is to contact the project officer in charge of your project to discuss with him how he sees things, or he or she.
And maybe also a quick word to insist that the link to the COVID-related FAQs is also added on the event page.
Very good. Thanks, Olivier. Coming back to the question, maybe to say it even a bit more bluntly. So the justification for such shift cannot be, we have some spare money on the travel, so let's use it for personnel. It must be linked to the tasks that you do and the need for actually doing more work on the one or the other work package. Okay, next question. What if the actual hours in a year are below or above 1720 hours? Yeah, that is actually, it should be like this, but Isabel, you can explain.
Yeah, well, actually, that's all the interest of this option, is that you apply this figure, fixed 70-20 hours, whatever the real hours were. So that's why it makes it simple. And then the only thing that we said is that if the person is a part-time worker, then you apply a pro rata. But that's the only time where you deduct, where you change the amount.
Okay. Next question, can we remunerate our staff in the form of an extra bonus to his regular salary, supported by a timesheet without the additional work contract? I assume that is linked a bit to the project-based remuneration and to the bonuses. Isabel, please.
Well, I maybe will also call my colleague David onto this. So,
yes,
yeah, if David, if you have a...
Yeah.
Ready?
Well, we will need another separate webinar to this question. Because in theory, yes. I mean, well, first, you can pay your people as you want. The question is if it is eligible or not for the Horizon 2020 action. So we never impose, and we couldn't impose how you pay your employees. That's clear. Now, regarding the eligibility in Horizon 2020 actions, there's a lot of whereas to be taken into account. For instance, you have this extra bonus. As Isabel explained it, if the extra bonus applies only to EU actions or to this action, out. For us, it's not eligible. It must be something that you generally apply. Then if the extra bonus is paid not based on objective conditions, so if today the boss, because he's happy and the business is going well, decides to put an extra money in your payslip, it's not eligible either. If you want a bonus to be eligible in Horizon 2020, it must be based in objective conditions. So I, as a worker, must be able to know what do I have to do to get that bonus, to put it simple. And finally, not to get into too many details, it's very important to assess, to check if the bonus is triggered by the participation in a specific projects. It's different if I get a bonus, for instance, at the end of the year because there is a general assessment on performance in the company, for instance, and the 3 best performers of the company based on a series of criteria defined ex ante get an extra money. Okay, that goes into the non-project based remuneration. There would be an eligibility objective conditions for who will get how much. Normally you could include it in the calculation of the hourly rate. Now, if it goes really into, well, you will get this bonus because you work in a project, then we will be in this context of the project-based remuneration that Isabel had a slide on that during her presentation. And then you really need to see in detail the annotated grant agreement, because there are quite a number of conditions that you need to assess to decide if you can charge or not that bonus to the Horizon 2020 action. And I must say that if there is something complex about personal costs in Horizon 2020, it's this project-based remuneration, let's be frank. It doesn't mean that it's ununderstandable. If you go into the AGA and you dedicate sufficient time to it, you will see how much and when it can be eligible, but it's complex. So these are the basic ideas. Something that is only for the EU actions not eligible. Some bonus that is paid not based on objective conditions, so decided out of the blue if you want, is not eligible either. And if the bonus is paid because of the participation on a specific projects, you need to check very carefully the explanations in the annotated grant agreement for project-based remuneration. Thanks.
Okay, next question. I am working for my organization on average 30 hours per month. I am not working in any other H2020 project. May I declare that I work 100% on the action? Isabel?
Yes, so I understand this is about a person who would be considering that to support the hours worked on the action rather than using a timesheet, they wonder if they could use a declaration of exclusive dedication to the action. But you have to be careful with the use of this declaration, because in fact, when you are using this, you have to use a declaration template, and you can only use one per reporting period, and it has to cover at least a period uninterrupted of one full calendar month, during which the person will have been, all the hours of the person working for the beneficiary will have to be dedicated to this Horizon 2020 action. So already in the text of the question, I see that the person is not working on the other Horizon 2020 project, but that sounds like maybe this person is working on other things. So then it would not be dedicated exclusively to the action. So you have to be very sure before you start to use the declaration that you will be able to comply with the conditions, and that you will not need at a certain point and realize that you should have used timesheets, because then it's often too late to use timesheets. So if you have any doubt, it's just better to stick to timesheets.
Thank you. I just see that there is another question popping up, which is very much related to this. Is there a template for declaration of exclusiveness? Yes, there is.
And it's in the annotated model grant agreement. There is a link to it also under Article 18.
Okay, let's go to the next one. Once the costs are submitted, how can you submit changes on the personnel costs if you realize there's an error? That's simple to reply, Isabel.
Yes, so that's called an adjustment. And when you are reporting in the next reporting period, you have this possibility to adjust costs that you declared in previous reporting periods, specifically for an error.
Okay. Again, the next one is a question on people linked to the project not being employees. Okay, staff members are working full-time for the beneficiary, but not as employees. They invoice their monthly fee through their management company. Is that possible?
Well,
David,
go ahead, David.
Well, the situation is tricky. So they are not employees. That's clear. So our first and easiest case of how to calculate the personal cost for employees, it does not apply to this situation. Typically, we should be looking into this other personnel working under a direct contract that is not an employment contract, but here they don't work under a direct contract, because if we got it right, the contract is with the management company, so with an incorporated entity, which is not the natural person. So there is no direct contract, which complicates largely the thing. In this context, you may have two possible approaches. If you cannot find other way to do it, you may have two possible approaches. On the one side, you might have to declare this as subcontracting and comply with the rules for subcontracting, simply because it doesn't fit in the other categories. You don't have this direct contract with the person, but with another company. That would be, if they cannot be your employees, the easier way to deal with, but it implies that you will not be entitled to the 25% indirect cost flat rate for their costs. The other much more complex workaround for this situation is by entering these management companies as third parties in the contract, which provide you with in-kind contributions, like seconded staff. We haven't spoken today about these third parties, and frankly, it's too extensive to get into details now in 10 minutes. I would recommend, if you see no other option, if they cannot be your employees, if they cannot work directly via their management company as beneficiaries, or even as linked third parties to you, if there is no other option, I recommend you to check into the annotated grant agreement on the part of in-kind contributions to see if you can manage through that. But that would be really the most complex option. So try to see if there is no way in which they are your employees, if there is no way in which they can participate through their management companies directly, either as beneficiaries or as your link third parties, if there is no way to get them as subcontractors, and only then go to this last very complex option. But I already gave you 3 possible paths, even if no easy.
Okay, good. The next question I see moves away from the personnel cost category to the subcontracting, which we didn't cover today in the webinar, but I think we can still reply to this question. How to justify best value for money? David, again?
I think this is more for Dinos.
Okay, then please, Dinos, go ahead.
Yeah, best value for money depends on the subject matter. So if we're talking about big amounts, and if we're talking about public organizations, then you are subject to the public procurement rules, and therefore you need to pass through tenders. But this is not what we mostly see in Horizon 2020. What we mostly see in Horizon 2020 is any kind of evidence that the best value for money, that the principle for best of value for money is reached. And this can be done in various cases. It depends on the way that you have set up your business. What we mostly want to see is that you have done some comparison. And therefore, the optimal way is to show that you have reviewed some offers. If you want to do an acquisition, or if you want to subcontract part of your costs to somebody who is not in the consortium, but it is brought to the consortium as a subcontractor, you need to make sure that there is some cost-benefit analysis, that you have analyzed the offers. We propose 3 offers for analysis, and we propose that there is a conclusive reaction, that therefore you have assessed the pros and the cons, the costs and the benefits, and that you have concluded that this is the best provider because it gives me the best combination of price and quality. Now, if you are in a niche market and there is only one single provider, and you can prove that there was nobody out there in the market apart from this single provider, then we will have to double check this with our expertise internally in the European Commission services. And if this is the case, then this is another way to prove the best value for money. Therefore, if there is only one single provider in the market, obviously you meet the principle of best value for money. Another way is to pass through framework contracts. That means that you have contractual terms with your providers. You have long-lasting contractual terms that they go above and beyond of the action. Therefore, this is your normal providers in the normal course of the business, and you select among them. This is another way to prove the best value for money, the long-standing relationship or the use of resources from a framework contract that you have with third parties and that you consume with them each time by analyzing which is the best offer. As a principle, therefore, we won't dictate the way that you do it, but we will ask you to make sure that there is some proof that the cost-benefit analysis has taken place.
Okay. Next question again on the electronic signature of timesheets. And there are 2 parts to the reply. One is that was already given. So if your organization has an electronic time recording system that fulfills these minimum conditions, meaning people cannot just go there and change where and whatever they want. You have a login and password system. You can track and trace who changed what. Then, of course, this system can be used fully electronically, no matter under which circumstances. But on the other hand, if you normally did this on paper, and now we are in the situation of teleworking for many of us, indeed, there is a particular way of doing this. And this particular way is described in one of the FAQs that I mentioned before. So if you want to know exactly how this works, please go to the FAQs page and pick the one that deals with the signature of timesheets. And again,
Peter, I have it now with me. May I try to share my screen? I like that. They also see how they look like the FAQs. I'm gonna try to share it. Voila. So I hope that now you are seeing my screen.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. So, well, probably you are thinking, or you are not necessarily so familiar with the portal and where to find things. So if you go into Google or any other tool like that and just type Horizon 2020 FAQ COVID, that's what I did. You will get into the list of the COVID-related questions for Horizon 2020. And this is one example, which is the one about the signature of the timesheets. Precisely because we are aware that in many cases it's not possible for those who are keeping paper timesheets, and you cannot go to the office and you are not going to send in by post, for instance, the timesheets of one person to the supervisor to sign. So we have already anticipated the situation here. You can see that it was anticipated already in April 2020. And then one of the possibilities that we offer there is that you simply send a scan or a picture of the timesheet from the person to the supervisor, who replies by email saying, okay, I agree with this. You keep the 2 emails in your records in case of an audit, and that would be fine. And then when you read the question, you click on, was this answer helpful? Of course, yes. That's for us also. And this is how our FAQs look like. It's also a COVID example. And now I want to stop sharing, but at some moment in time, Peter, I'm going to try also to show in the Article 18 in the annotated grant agreement, because I have seen also several questions about where the links are, but this I'm going to look for it separately, and probably I will ask you for another small break to show it in a few minutes, okay?
Yes, very good. I think that's really helpful to point people to the exact places. So as soon as you're ready, just tell me and we will give you the slot. Okay, and in the meantime, go to the next questions. How to decide whether consultants are natural persons or subcontractors? Dinos again, or Isabel? Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I can start, but Dinos also explained some aspects in his presentation. So consultants can fall as under the case of natural persons with a direct contract with a beneficiary, and then that's the personal costs. The conditions for that are explained in the Article 6.2a.2 of your grant agreement. There's a list of the conditions. One of the main things is that you have to have a direct contract with the natural person, so not with, for example, a work agency. And then there are other conditions, such as notably the fact that the consultant is working under similar conditions as those of an employee, that also that the fact his work is supervised like the one of employee, that there is time recording of his hours, and also that he's paid rather on the time for the time work than for an output. So you need to check the various conditions in 6.2a.2, and if you fulfill all these conditions, then you can say that it's a natural person working under a direct contract and it's personal cost. And then the fallback, if you don't comply with the conditions, is then you can check if it's a subcontract, but then there are the conditions of the subcontract that also need to be complied with, and the main ones are the fact that the subcontract must be awarded ensuring best value for money and the absence of conflict of interest, and Dinos has explained us a bit more about the best value for money notably.
Dinos, anything to complement?
No, I think it's a full reply. I think it's
okay. So next question, who should sign the timesheets if two partners owning the SME and the scientific director works on the project without a supervisor? So yes, if I am the boss myself, who signs my timesheet?
May I, Peter, may I now try to share my screen, and then we see also, we profit of the question to see also how it looks like in the annotated grant agreement. Go for it. So this is page 179 of the annotated model grant agreement, which we speak under Article 18 for the requirements on timesheets. Okay, so when persons do not work exclusively for the actions, the beneficiaries might keep the timesheets. And here you can see what are the minimum conditions. You have already the explanations as basically what I summarized for the computer-based, for the electronic timesheets. And in any case, the minimum conditions that your timesheets need to comply with to be fully in line with our requirements. A little bit further down, you can see the hyperlink to the template for timesheets. I insist, this is just in case you don't have anything else and you are wondering how to cope with this. Here you have an example of what you can use, where obviously all the minimum requirements are already incorporated. And frankly, it's extremely simple. It's much simpler than most of the timesheets that we usually find when we go to beneficiaries. Somebody asked also where was the template for the declaration of exclusive work, the exclusive dedication. Is a little bit further up into the annotated model grant agreement. So here you can see the link. To messages, this is in the section of documents of the portal, but again, you forget, you don't want to spend your time finding your way in the portal, or simply sometimes even quicker, Google or something like that, annotated model grant agreement or H2020, and you get first results this document. And for the signatures, if you are the only one in the person, you are the only one signing it. There is no other work around about that. It's not a problem in itself. And I stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. And we go to the next question. Olivier, can you bring up the screen? Yes, again. How can I calculate the productive hours if the employee is part-time? Isabel, quick reply.
Well, if we're going to take the example of the when you use the annual productive hours as a fixed number of 1720, if the employee is part-time, that's mean in its contract it has a part-time work of, let's say, 50%. You calculate the pro rata of 1720, so you divide it by 2, and that's what the figure that you would use when calculating your hourly rate. Yeah, that's the main thing for the simpler option of the annual productive hours.
Isabel?
Yes. And you would, I understand you would do the same in the other 2 options for individuals. Well, no, yeah. For the standard, maybe dinos can come because then it depends on your practice, but I understand you would still have to apply a pro rata.
Yeah, I think it's simple here. You do a simple time apportionment of the time that you work. So you adjust the annual figures into the figures that they reflect the productive hours of a person who doesn't work full time. So if you work 80%, you adjust by 80%. You do a simple time apportionment.
Okay. Next question. Is a freelancer working in an SME a consultant or an employee? I guess the question means, can they be charged as personnel costs or as subcontractor? Isabel?
But for an employee, you need an employment contract. So that would not be really the case for a freelancer. And then for a consultant, it's what we have explained in the previous question. So you have to check if it can fall under personal cost under the category of a natural person with a direct contract with the SME. And you have to see notably that the contract is directly with the natural person, not via another company. And then fulfill all the conditions of working under similar conditions as an employee, etc. And if ever you do not fulfill these conditions, then you may be more in the case of a contract for a purchase of service or subcontract. And there you apply the conditions. You have to check the conditions that you are ensuring best value for money and the absence of conflict of interest.
Okay, next question. What is the definition of an SME owner? Is it more than 50% of the shares of the SME or something else?
So it's any percentage in the ownership of the company, but it has to be direct ownership. But it can be a much lower ownership percentage of the SME. And then you can be considered as an owner. And if you don't receive a salary, you apply the fixed hourly rate that we call the SME owner unit cost.
So yes, just to emphasize again, the important condition for using this SME owner manager unit cost is that you do not get a salary from your SME. And indeed, the percentage of how much you own is of no importance for us, as long as you own something in that SME directly.
Peter, I would like to do a clarification here. No correction, but further information, because there has been occasional disagreements on the side or misunderstandings on the side of the beneficiaries. And I would like to clarify that in the context of Horizon 2020, when we speak about a salary, we refer something that is paid under an employment contract. So if you have another type of contract, a service contract, and every month you get the same money, for us is not a salary. In the context of Horizon 2020, salary goes with employment contract. And I think this is important because it doesn't happen every day, but we have had some cases in which the beneficiary The SME owner had a private contract, a service contract, or a commercial contract, call it as you want, but not an employment contract, through which the person was getting every month the same. Fine, but for us, it doesn't qualify as a salary for the purpose of the SME owner personal cost calculation. The person still has to use the SME owner unit cost. I think it's an important clarification because we have had a couple of cases like that.
Yes, thank you very much. We go to the next question. Is it possible to increase the number of person months without increasing the direct personnel costs? If so, should we report that? Oh, now it has disappeared. Oh, now we have it again. If so, should we report that in periodic reports? I would assume that this is the abbreviation, or notify the project officer. Does any one of you grasp the essence of this question?
Well, in fact, one clarification: the moment that you put this into the periodic reports, you are notifying the PO. So that both things go one with the other. Now, I would like perhaps to go back to the principle that what you put in the budget is not what you have to report. You have to report the reality. So if eventually you have worked more than what you expected to work in accordance to the budget, you report the reality. You work more, you declare more. Perhaps you get no extra money because the maximum grant amount, so the maximum money that we put aside for your grant has been already reached, but you still have to report the reality of the person months incurred and the reality of the cost resulting from this time worked in the action. If there is a deviation, a significant deviation between what was anticipated in the grant agreement in Annex 1 for the person months efforts with the amount that you declare, you will need to provide an explanation. But this, I think, is perfectly understandable that, okay, there is a certain margin of doubt, I would say, between what was supposed at the beginning that it would take and what at the end takes. If this margin is too wide, well, you will have to explain why, but nothing more than that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I had hoped we had replied this by the presentations. I am an SME owner and I do not receive a salary. How can I declare my costs in a project? Then you are exactly in that situation, and you should use, or I would say you must use, the SME owner manager unit cost option. That means there is a predefined hourly rate that is fixed by the commission. You charge your hours and you multiply your hours with this predefined fixed hourly rate, and you charge your costs in this way. Next question, with the option fixed annual cost 1720, which payrolls should I use? Last 12 months prior to the start of the project, or last 12 months prior to the date of justification? Isabel, I think you can reply quickly to this one.
When you're doing the calculation, and we understand here you would be doing the calculation on annual basis, you need to have the figures of the full financial year. So when at the time of reporting, so that at the end of your first, for example, reporting period, you have to see for the months covered by your reporting period, if you have the full financial year at your disposal. If you have, then, because presumably that won't be the year before the beginning of your project, because normally a reporting period lasts in average 18 months. So normally you should have at least the full financial year of the first 12 months, let's say, and then you will use this full financial year. And then if for the last month of the reporting period, let's say, for example, the 6 months, you are in an ongoing financial year, then you don't have the full financial year, you don't have these figures at your disposal, and then you use the figures of the last closed financial year.
Yes, I think the question is indeed really pertinent only in case that you have reporting periods below 12 months, which is normally not the case for us. So for us, the minimum reporting period is in the order of 12 months, with a few exceptions. And then we would assume that you have already the annual figures for this year in which the project already was running. Okay, next one. Can we claim hours spent during the project meetings as productive hours? Isabel?
So, firstly, in the question you say as productive hours, I think here we should really separate the fact that you're going to report the hours that you worked on the project, and then you multiply them by an hourly rate for the calculation of which you use productive hours. So for the productive hours to calculate your hourly rate, you have to use one of the three options. And there, notably, for example, if you take the 1720, there's nothing to change about it. And for the other options, this will be based on what we call the annual workable hours. Now, concerning the hours that you declare as having worked on the action, presumably the project meetings will be part of your action tasks, and they can be considered as hours related to work on the project, but you also have to put them in your timesheets.
Okay, very clear. We are reaching the end of the meeting, so I would now formally close it, but if my colleagues still have a bit of time, we have a few questions left, and instead of coming back to them in writing, and for the participants that are actually interested in these other questions, I can suggest that we spend a bit more time and go through these other questions, if okay for you. David, Isabel, Dinos, will you
for me,
be available for half an hour?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's do like this. I will now officially close the full meeting. The ones of you who want still to hear the replies to these last few questions, you are invited to stay. For all the others, thank you very much again for your active participation, for the interesting questions. And I refer again to the event website where all the material, all the links to the different sources of information will become available, including the record, the full record of this meeting. So thank you very much again and have a nice day. And I see that people start leaving. I assume that some of you will stay and we will simply continue and go to the rest of the questions. Okay, next one. In 2020, some staff did not fill in correctly their timesheet, not identifying the time spent on the project, mainly transverse personnel. How can I correct it? Isabel?
Maybe that's more for an audit perspective of what would be considered correct, because the thing is, one of the conditions for to fulfill your timesheets is you do it maximum monthly. So if it's been a long time, it's going to perhaps raise an issue. I don't know, Dinos, if you have a view on how this could be done in a way that ensure the reliability of the timesheet, because that's the main thing about timesheets. They have to be considered reliable.
Okay, so let's imagine what has happened here. So you have evidence that the persons have worked, but you have failed to, but these persons have failed to report it in the time records, if I understand it correctly. So if the year is still ongoing, or if you haven't yet submitted your financial statements, then you need to go backwards and complement the missing information to the extent that this reflects reality. And the missing information is, for instance, if there is the name or the signature or whatever is missing apart from the hours, then you can complement the missing information and you can complete the time records. If now you have forgotten to report the hours, then it's not so easy, because you need to make sure that the correction that you do reflects the reality. So therefore, you need to be able to document and support the hours that you have spent to the action. You may need to ask the person who has forgotten to fill in the time records to go backwards in time and see what kind of activity logs he has, what kind of emails, meetings, invitations, agendas, participations or working papers, deliverables, whatever he can build back to make sure that the hours that he or she is charging reflect the reality that took place some months ago. It's a difficult exercise. We see it in the audit profession when we have missing entries or when we do not rely on the information that we have, and we call it review of alternative evidence. If you want to avoid the errors, try not to do it. Try not to enter in these circumstances. Try to be punctual and report the hours when they are about to be reported and not retroactively. This is a risky environment, the one that you explained here.
Okay. Next question. Can I use the same cost per hour throughout the project? I assume the reply is no, but Isabel, please.
It's not very clear for me, but the only thing I see is that you're going to do, if you're doing the calculation of your hourly rate on an annual basis, you're going to do it once per year. And then one thing that may change is the amount of personal cost, the actual personal cost for the year. Then the productive hours, notably if you're using 1720, will not change. And if ever your actual personal costs have not changed from one year to the other, then you would have the same hourly rate.
Yes, again, the main remark here is you have to report reality. So if indeed throughout the project your salary did not change a cent, and you have always used the 1720 method, then yes, but that's not a very normal situation. Okay, next question. If an employee is sick and not working one day, how is the 1720 adjusted? So
in fact, you don't adjust the 1720 for sick leave, you don't deduct it, so you still just put 1720. That's again one of the advantages of this option for the productive hours, because it's very simple. You keep to 1720. In the case of sick leave, the only thing that you deduct in terms of leave is parental leave.
Yes, very clear. Is the personnel cost wizard only available when completing a financial statement? Here the answer is yes. We don't have a playground for this, which it would be very difficult to provide. You can use it only when at the time you complete your financial statement. But again, we have a guidance document describing how it would work, and the link to this document will also be on the event website. Next question. What are the financial reporting obligations for Marie Curie actions? We deliberately did not cover Marie Skłodowska-Curie here because it's a completely different system. It's based on unit costs, but I don't know whether, Isabel, you can describe in 5 words what the peculiarities of Marie Skłodowska-Curie are.
Well, it's simpler in the term that as you have unit costs, you just need to determine how many units you effectively used for carrying out the work, and then you multiply the number of units by the unit cost. So it's simpler in terms of reporting. And as for the timing, it's the same as for the grants. That's at the moment of the end of the reporting period when you have to fill in your financial statement.
Okay. Next question. What if my salary as SME owner is below the fixed hourly rate defined by the commission? So that here the answer is also very clear. If you get a salary, you have to claim your salary. The fixed rate you can only use when you are in the case that you don't get a salary. That's as simple as it is. If an employee participates in more than one project, must his/her personal timesheets include all projects or only one project? That's a pertinent question, and Isabella, I'm sure you will reply very quickly to this one.
So we only request to have the timesheets on their action concerned, However, it may be simpler if you are working in several Horizon 2020 projects to have this visibility. But in terms of requirement, we are only interested to know what you work on the given Horizon 2020 action.
Okay, next question. Flight tickets have been purchased in March 2020 and so on. Will these costs be reimbursed by the EC? This is also a question that is, I think, covered in one of our FAQs. And the answer, I think, is in principle, yes, if you undertook the necessary effort to get these costs reclaimed. And you can also show us that you have undertaken these efforts, but you didn't succeed. I hope I was correct, Isabel.
Yes, yes, and this indeed linked to the notion of force majeure. If you were in a situation where you couldn't do anything else than not using them, and you did all the, you used all due diligence to obtain the reimbursement, but in this case you couldn't, then these costs could still be eligible if they comply also with all the other eligibility normal conditions.
Okay, next question. The best value for money we have already replied earlier, but there is a second part. Is there a limit under which no justification is needed? Dinos.
Limit should be to the way that your business expense and to the nature of the consumables. So if it is tiny items that they are not even capitalized, or small transactions, but there is no threshold, neither monetary nor percentage-wise, then indeed we will process them as standard acquisitions. So for petty transactions, petty cash, small amounts, we most probably not even sample them, so they don't have that much of chances of being sampled. However, our sample is risk-based, and also it is random, so there is a very tiny chance that we may sample it. However, I would say that you need to be prudent in all your expenditure, even if they are small or high values. The thresholds are different and the procedures are different, but the principle of prudence should apply equally and across the board. Recommended procedure is to be wise, to expend as if you would have expended, even if you were participating on the European project or not. Apply your usual accounting practices, therefore.
Okay, the next one is also for you, Dinos. Is there a template for external auditors to follow? If so, where can it be found?
Yes, there is. It is called Indicative Audit Program, with an abbreviation IAP. If you Google Indicative Audit Program, is the first hint that comes into the Google search. You click and you see how we perform the audits. And like this, we ensure homogeneity and consistency of approaches across the board and an equal treatment for all beneficiaries.
So next one, I think we tried at least to reply already earlier. What signature programs accepted by the EU to sign the timesheets? We don't prescribe any particular method for electronic signatures. What we say is that your system must be at least protected with individual personal accounts and passwords, and with possibility to trace back all the transactions that were made in the system, but no particular prescription of any of the technical systems. It doesn't have to be qualified electronic signature, which would be the highest form of digital signature that is the real equivalent to paper signature. It's not necessary to go that high. Again, password, personal account, and traceability are sufficient. Next question, how many person months does the Commission consider in a year? 12 person months or 11 person months because of holidays? Again, I should refer to what we said before. The person months issue for Horizon 2020 has no direct relation to the calculation of the personnel costs. This is more for the justification of the efforts towards our project officers. And here you apply your usual practice, whatever it is in your organization. Next question. Option 2, our employment contracts allow vacation days to be carried over into the following year. How to calculate the individual annual productive hours? So this is, okay. So this is, you want to use actually option 2. Isabel, can you try to explain?
Yeah, so we're talking here about option 2 among the options for your annual productive hours. So if you're using the individual annual productive hours, you will be counting the days of leave actually taken in a given year by a given person. So it will be on an individual basis and what they actually took during that year.
Okay. Next one. If an employee exceeds 1720, for example, 1760, may this cause trouble? Should we report it? I think it's again a misunderstanding on the meaning of the 1720. Isabel.
Yes, so the 1720 is again one of the options for the productive hours when you're calculating your hourly rate. So here it's a fixed number that you use to calculate the hourly rate. It's always 1720, except if there's parental leave, but otherwise it's always 1720. And that's for the calculation of the hourly rate, and it's different from the number of hours that you worked on the action and for which you are going to provide timesheets, and this number of hours that you will multiply by the hourly rate. But as for the calculation of the hourly rate, when you have to divide the personal costs by annual productive hours, this 1720 fixed number does not change, whatever you really worked.
Okay, next one. What percentage of H2020 partners are being audited on average per year? So somebody wants to try their luck apparently to see what is the chance of not being audited. Dinos, please.
Well, we perform around something like 500 audits per year, and each audit contains on average 3 funded action, and each action contains on average 2 financial statements. So you multiply the 2 financial statements times the 3 actions per average times the 500 audits that we do on average per year, and you get your reply.
Yes, and maybe to say it in different terms, I think over the course of a framework program, the number of grants audited is in the 1-digit percentage still, isn't it?
Correct, yes. And it's not a secret, is
yes.
We have a limit. We have a limit on this, which shouldn't exceed the 7%. So that's
yes.
But it is annual and multi-annual. That means that if you were not audited this year, you may be audited the year after and the year ahead, and the payments have not yet finished. And as long as there are payments, there are going to be audits, and the audits will be continued for the years to come.
Yes, but again, please don't take a bet on not being audited. Try to use and apply the rules as we just tried to explain it. Next one, can we increase the number of person months without affecting the assigned budget? I think this is again a question not really related to the cost calculation. It is about the resources and effort you want to employ to reach the goals of the project. And this is something that you should discuss with your project officer. So if it's justified by the technical nature of the work, if indeed you find out during the course of the project that you need more effort to fulfill the one or the other task, it can be possible, but please discuss it with your project officer, and there might be a need also to amend the technical annex of the project if these are indeed major changes. Next one, which components of overhead costs may be counted as eligible indirect components? That is an important question, Isabel.
Well, for this, you don't really have to worry about what is included is in indirect costs, overheads, because under Horizon 2020, to calculate indirect costs, we apply a flat rate of 25% on a pool of direct costs, and this is done automatically at the reporting. So it's rather an easy process.
Or to say it differently, the direct costs that you charge are not supposed to contain any elements of indirect costs. They should be direct costs. And in particular for the personnel costs, that is the case. You charge your direct personnel costs, and then automatically a 25% flat rate is applied to cover indirect costs. Okay, next question. Are we supposed to report hours worked against work packages in timesheets also? I think that's David's special area, isn't it? David?
Yes, I'm there. And well, you are supposed to be able to report on person months. So you need to keep trace also of the number of hours worked on the work packages, because when you report on the technical reports to allocate the person months to the work package, you need some basis on which this allocation is done. So we indeed suggest that in the time records you have a reference to the work packages on what the hours were spent. No more than that. Otherwise, you can have it also in parallel, but it will imply double recording of the hours somehow. So the message is you should have a reference indeed to the work packages.
Okay, next one. How to calculate person month when the personnel has different contracts, 30 hours per month, 22 hours per month, some changing during the year. Can we use the standard method? Isabel, can you try?
Well, as you indicated, when you can talk about person month, you're not person month are not used for the calculation of personal costs. So person month are used to report in the technical report on the efforts that you deployed in terms of human resources to carry out the action. And there, how you come up with a person month is up to your own practices. We don't prescribe how to calculate your person month.
Well, to expand a little bit further on the discussion, because it might not only be for the personal months, but it might be a real case that you have fluctuations within the months and you have peaks and downs because some months you work more, some others less. On August, you go for vacations and you work zero, and therefore you have huge fluctuations. So if your question relates to the hourly rate, and not only for the personal months, because the hourly rate is the thing that counts on the very end, is to respect what you have actually selected for your driver into the personnel cost calculation. So if you have selected the 1,720, you are already covered, because the only thing that you should make sure is that you do not exceed on the very end of the accounting year the figure of 1,720. You will have fluctuations within the months, but at the end of the year, when you do your test, you should limit yourself to the 1,720. And for the options 2 and 3, obviously you will still have fluctuations. You cannot use the monthly method and with option 2, so this goes aside. And for the option 3, you should make the same test as the 1,720, but at this case, you should do a double test. You should see that your productive hours are not less than 90% of your workable time, and you should see that the totality of the hours that you charge do not exceed the productive hours. And that should cover your internal fluctuations on the months that you work more than others, or the months that you don't work at all.
Okay, thank you. Next one. For SME owners on service contracts, shall we assume that the unit cost is eligible and the rest can be covered by not funded resources of the SME? Oof.
Yes, Peter, in reality, I don't think that is so. Well, first of all, I would like to clarify for those who do not know how this SME owner unit cost works, is that there is an amount which is around 34 euros per hour, and then there is a country correction coefficient, which makes that in some countries these 34 euros are adjusted downside, and for some countries they are adjusted up, they are upgraded if you want. So it's not exactly the same amount for everyone. It depends also on the place where it's located, the SME. Then we agree on the unit cost, so we pay on the basis of the unit cost. Then obviously how the company pays for that service contract, in this case the service contract for the SME owners, is nothing that concerns the Horizon 2020 grant agreement. So you can also imagine on using the flat rate of the indirect cost, so the EU contribution that you generate through the flat rate for indirect costs to pay the difference to the SME owner. That's something that is not regulated by the grant agreement. What the grant agreement says is, if you are an SME owner with a salary, you will get this amount as EU contribution, or this amount of eligible cost through the unit cost and the corresponding EU contribution. How to pay the rest is not regulated by the grant agreement.
Okay, next question: how frequently do we need to declare these personnel costs? For instance, once per year. For our purpose, you have to declare them at each reporting period, and the reporting periods, the exact timing is defined in your grant agreement. The usual reporting period is 18 months. That's the reply to this one. Next one: when an employee returns from maternity leave, she is entitled to some hours of breastfeeding leave. Should she be considered as full-time or as part-time?
So in this case, when you the breastfeeding leave can be considered as a continuation of the maternity leave, and then for maternity leave, parental leave, we have this special feature that you can deduct the time spent on leave from the annual productive hours, and that's in all three options, so that you would be rather doing it like that you deduct this time spent on the leave from the productive hours.
Okay, next one: can SMEs include in the project the costs of fees for advisors involved in the project? I think the general reply is yes. The question is where to declare, under personnel costs or under subcontracting or under other costs. Dinos, can you quickly reply?
Okay, here you have to distinguish the fact that there are costs of consultants and costs for advisors. So it depends on the nature of the expenditure. Advisory costs, I share with you the fact that I haven't seen them that often on SMEs. Simply because advisory costs are those fees that the entities pay to their accountants, financial service providers, lawyers, IT specialists, and they are not necessarily linked to the action. So before we enter into the question, how can I pay for my advisory fees, and how will the commission pay my expenditure for the advisory fees, then I would like to return back the question into the next wording. Is this advisory fee absolutely related for the funded action? Or you would have done it anyhow, and you would have requested this advisory fee irrespectively of your participation into the European action or not? If the reply is that you definitely need this advisory fee for the action, that would be assimilated into a consultancy cost, and that would be assimilated into the cost that you employ for a natural person under direct contract, or if you don't follow that scheme, that would be a cost for subcontracting. In both instances, it's good to introduce this into the discussions that you have while you sign the grant agreement, because it's good for the services to know that you are entering into these kind of transactions. I share with you the fact that I don't see it very often in the audits that we do. What we see is that general advisory fees for IT, for consultancy, for HR, for taxation, for whatever any kind of reason that you necessarily need these fees, but not for the action. And these are not eligible costs. And these are only in the nature of indirect and covered already by the flat rate of 25%.
Okay, thank you very much. I see we have now spent the next half hour on replying questions, and there is still a relatively long list. But I mean, at least I personally have to leave very soon. So, but on the other hand, I see that there are still several hundred colleagues following us in this webinar. So can I maybe suggest that we answer 5 more questions, and I leave the participants now a few moments to vote on the remaining questions and to tell us which are the 5 most important that we should now still reply. So please go to Slido and put your vote on the remaining questions. Okay, I see there is not a change in the order, at least for the ones that are now visible on my screen. Then let's maybe go and reply indeed to the next 5 questions. And then unfortunately, I think we have to close this session. Okay, what about a single consultant who is a full participant in a project? I'm neither an SME owner nor an employee. Again, the question of consultants. How to charge their costs. Isabel?
I'm not sure
No.
if this is covering the case of a natural person,
Yes.
but it's something that we have not covered yet, so it's maybe interesting to point it out, as it's not so frequent. If you are a natural person participating as such in an action, then you can use the same system of unit cost as for an SME owner. So it's the same system that you have a fixed hourly rate, and then you just this fixed hourly rate is indicated in the Annex 2A of your grant agreement, and they just indicate at the time of reporting the time that you worked, and it will multiply it by the hourly rate. So it's quite similar to the SME owner, though it's for this time natural persons participating in a project.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next one is again a question on detail, but important. How do we calculate the hourly rate per month if at the beginning of the month the employee is part-time and then becomes full-time in the middle of the month? Maybe David, can you?
It's a matter of proratas of the hours,
Mm-hmm.
but it depends on at what moment the person changes. So if you are in the monthly hourly rate, remember we said monthly hourly rates more complex than annual hourly rates. So if you are in the monthly hourly rate, you will need to see up to the moment in which the person changes the contract. You will apply a pro rata of 1/12 of the annual hourly rates that will correspond to that contract. And for the rest of the days, you will need to apply a pro rata of 1/12 of the new annual hourly rates that correspond to the new full-time contract. Add the two, and you will have the monthly productive hours, which, as you see, is quite much more complex than having just the annual calculation.
And I assume this case is not covered even by our wizards. So this calculation you would have to do
manually, yeah,
manually on a sheet of paper. Okay. Are in-kind benefits like private health insurance eligible as personnel costs? Isabella?
So in-kind benefits in general, they can be part of their remuneration if and eligible if they are justified and registered as personal costs in accordance with the usual accounting practices of the beneficiary. And so they could be part of the actual personal cost that you use to calculate the personal cost that you report, yes.
Okay. And the next one, what kind of documents do we need in terms of personnel costs in case of an audit besides timesheets, contracts, salaries, receipts? I think we tried to reply this again, but maybe Dinos now seeing already the enumeration. What else?
The person that has raised the question has got it right, because this is mostly what we ask. Yes, indeed, we ask contracts, time sheets, salary receipts, yes. But on top of that, we ask extracts from the general ledger to make sure that the costs are calculated correctly and that they reflect the reality, and extracts from the calculation of your productive hours. I said before that you can dig into the further reviews by reviewing the indicative audit program. So go to Google and search indicative audit program, and then you will see which kind of documentation is expected by the auditors to be requested every time that we review the personnel cost.
Okay. And now I'm afraid we come to the last question because of the limit of time. For a Marie Curie individual fellowship, 100% of the hours should be towards the grant associated work. So do we still need to report personnel hours? Isabel, do you know the reply?
I would no. I just like that.
No, but they don't need this, David. They don't need to keep personnel hours because the unit cost in Maria Skłodowska Curie is the month.
Yes.
So we are focusing on the contract and on the employment contract of the fellow, exactly. And there is no time recording sheets to be kept for them.
I think that is the correct reply, because the fellowships are having this condition that you employ somebody for this project, a fellow who works then by default 100% on this project. So no need to keep hourly time records. Okay. I'm afraid
Peter, the only case, just in case, because in some occasions here we are speaking about fellows which are supposed to work or that are committed to work 100%. It's not always systematically the case in all these grants. So if we are into part-time commitments, then they will need the time records to justify the part-time. But the answer for the 100%, so the typical fellowship with the person is hired for it, then they don't need it.
Okay, very good. So I'm afraid we have to stop here because of time. The discussion is very interesting, and thank you very much again to all the participants, and you were, many of you, patient enough to bear with us even until now. Again, thanks also to my colleagues, panel members, for the replies to all these questions. I refer again to the event website where all the material will be published. And then it rests only for me to wish you a very nice lunch break. By the way, we will have a very sunny one here in Brussels, exceptionally. Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.